All right, welcome to the review video for Ezekiel quiz number 3. Now I'm going to tell you up front that this is probably a little bit more of a difficult quiz because of course we did not have a quiz 2, or your quiz 2 was your textbook check, and so we have a lot of material that's covered on this quiz. And unfortunately, it is a short answer quiz. The entire thing is a short answer quiz, 25 questions. All right, so definitely I would challenge you to maybe watch this video a couple of times. Definitely review your things, the things that we cover over this. All right, a couple of things that we covered. First of all, we talked about the fact that God sent Ezekiel to a particular type of audience. We gave you 3 different words that dealt with that. We said that they were a rebellious people, an impudent people, and a stiff-hearted people. And so that was a description of the kind of people that Ezekiel was sent to preach to. We also mentioned the fact that he was to preach to them whether they would hear or whether they would forbear. And so, of course, he was to keep preaching no matter what. God told him, he says, look, don't fear the audience, all right? And he specifically mentioned 3 different areas in which they weren't supposed to fear. He wasn't supposed to fear their words. He wasn't supposed to fear their response. And he wasn't supposed to fear their looks. And of course, that's good advice for any preacher even today. Of course, God gave him a scroll, and kind of a unique thing that God told him to do, which we also saw that John the Revelator did. He was commanded to eat the scroll. And of course, that dealt with fully digesting the message. And we mentioned the fact that the scroll, when eaten, it's sweet like honey, but bitter in the belly. And of course, that is the way the message of God often is. It's very sweet to digest, but sometimes when you think about the truths of it, it's a very bitter truth to think about. We mentioned the fact that God had Ezekiel, it says he sat where they sat. And we talked about the fact that for a preacher, oftentimes when they're able to sit where their congregation sits, they're able to see things from their point of view and also get a heart for God's people. And so those are 2 things that a man of God learns when he sits where the congregation sits. We mentioned the fact that God told Ezekiel that he was to be a watchman, and we mentioned he was supposed to warn the wicked of their wickedness and try to turn them from wickedness to righteousness. And he was also supposed to warn the righteous to not turn from their righteousness. And of course, it is mentioned that if a righteous man turns from his righteousness, the righteousness that he did previously won't be remembered. And of course, we've unfortunately seen that with men of God sometimes who have turned to wickedness, and all the good that they've done is kind of forgotten. We mentioned that God used Ezekiel in a unique way. He gave him a bunch of silent sermons, and one of those sermons dealt with the judgment of Israel. And of course, he was told to lay on his side for 390 days to talk to demonstrate the judgment that would be on Israel. And then he was to turn over on his other side and lay for 40 days dealing with the judgment or the years of iniquity for the tribes of Judah. During this time in which he was laying on his side, he was given a specific amount of food to eat and a specific amount of water to drink. And of course, we talked about the nastiness of the food. He had to eat defiled bread. And we mentioned the fact that the amount of food and the amount of water that God allowed him to eat and drink was just barely enough to keep a person alive. And of course, that dealt with the kind of food that they would have during their time of being under siege with Babylon. We mentioned God talked about how the siege would be, and he talked about 3 different ways in which people would die during the siege. And we mentioned the fact that they would die by famine, they would die by the sword, and they would die by pestilence. And of course, that was demonstrated by Ezekiel cutting off all his hair and dividing it into 3 parts. And he demonstrated by cutting up his hair in one instance, by burning up the hair in one instance, and then scattering the hair and chopping after it. We also mentioned the fact that he took a little bit of hair, put it in his belt, and that represented the remnant that God would would save out of the judgment there of the siege. So 3 ways in which they would die: sword, famine, and pestilence. We also mentioned a prophecy in which God took Ezekiel from Babylon area and brought him over to Jerusalem, to the temple area. We mentioned the fact that God showed him several abominations that were going on in Israel at the time. And of course, we mentioned the fact that, first of all, God showed him an image of jealousy, which was out in the temple courtyard. This image of jealousy actually right by the altar in which they would sacrifice things to God. Of course, that was very much an abomination. Then God told him to dig into the wall of the temple. And of course, he found a secret room. And there in that secret room, there was Jaazaniah, the son of Shaphan, and 24 other elders of the land. And of course, they had idols all around the room. They had creepy crawly things that were in that room. And of course, we mentioned the fact that that secret room really was the mind of the people, the imagination. It was really an indicator. There wasn't really a secret room. It was their imagination, their mind. Then we mentioned that there was an abomination where the 25 elders were had their backs to the temple and they were worshiping the sun. We mentioned those abominations. We also mentioned the fact that the women were weeping for Tammuz, which is a Babylonian god, and we mentioned the fact that because of these abominations, God said he was going to destroy the city. God did say in a vision, he had a vision where there were 6 angels and a man with an inkhorn, or God's recorder. And God told the man with the inkhorn, go and mark all the people that cry out against the abominations. Mark them. And of course, we mentioned the fact that demonstrated that God does protect his people, even when he's in judgment. God told the man with the inkhorn to get some coals of fire from a cherub that was part of the chariot of God, and that cherub gave him coals of fire. We mentioned the fact that the glory of God left Jerusalem out of the eastern gate, and of course, after it left the city, it went up and rested on top of the Mount of Olives. And we mentioned, of course, that Jesus both ascended out of the Mount of Olives, and someday he's coming back in the second coming and landing on the Mount of Olives. We mentioned the fact that there was a vision of the cauldron and the flesh. We mentioned the fact that the cauldron represented the city of Jerusalem, and the flesh represented the people. We also mentioned the fact that God promised to those people who were captive, that survived and they were captive, God says, I will be a little sanctuary to you. And mentioned the fact that he would protect them. We also talked about a silent sermon in which Ezekiel was eating bread and drinking his water. And God told him, eat and drink with quaking. And of course, that was to demonstrate the fear that the people would have while they were under siege. We mentioned a proverb that the people would say during these days. The proverb said, the days are prolonged and every vision faileth. And of course, we mentioned that vision that those false prophets were saying, that proverb was basically, don't worry about anything. God's not going to destroy the city. All those visions, they'll go away. We mentioned a prophecy against the false prophets where Ezekiel illustrated that those false prophecies were like a poorly built wall. He said it was like a wall with untempered mortar, and the wind would come along and just blow it right over. We mentioned the fact that these false prophecies had several devastating effects. Number 1, they made the heart of the righteous sad. Number 2, they strengthened the hands of the wicked. And number 3, they kept the wicked from repentance. And so once again, he was preaching against the false prophets. That is a full covering of what will be on this quiz. I think we've done a pretty good job of trying to tell you the things that are on there. Hopefully you will study this very much, and we'll see you on Thursday.